The evening of November 2nd, 1874, in Brookfield, New Hampshire, was cool and quiet. Inside the modest Hanson family home, a fire burned in the kitchen hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow across the walls. At the kitchen table sat 35-year-old Susan Hansen, accompanied by her mother and her brother. The mood in the house was tense. Susan was knitting, her needles moving steadily as she tried to keep her hands busy and her nerves under control. The following day, an important court hearing was scheduled. She had filed a lawsuit against her former fiancé, Joseph Bazelle, accusing him of breaking his promise to marry her. Her mother and brother spoke only occasionally, exchanging soft words in an effort to comfort Susan and distract her from her anxious thoughts about what lay ahead. At around 7 o'clock, as darkness settled outside the windows, the calm of the evening was shattered by a deafening blast. A shotgun had been fired directly through the kitchen window. Glass exploded inward, showering the room with shards. The charge of shot and lead struck Susan with horrifying precision, hitting her face and neck. She never had a chance to scream. The knitting slipped from her hands as she collapsed from her chair onto the kitchen floor. Her mother and brother rushed to her side in terror, but it was already too late. Susan Hansen was dead. The death had been instantaneous. Cold night air poured through the shattered window. Outside in the yard, the sound of retreating footsteps and the clatter of hooves faded into the darkness. The killer had fled. On the kitchen floor, illuminated by the firelight, lay the lifeless body of a woman who just moments earlier had been preparing for a courtroom battle in which she hoped to reclaim justice. Susan Hansen and Joseph Bazelle had known each other since childhood. Both were raised in the small town of Brookfield, New Hampshire, where everyone knew everyone else, and family lives were a matter of public knowledge. They began courting as teenagers, and their relationship seemed almost inevitable in a rural community with a limited pool of potential partners. At the time of Susan's murder, she was 35 years old. Bazelle was 38. By the standards of the era, both were considered well past the usual age for marriage. They were formally engaged, a promise that bound them not only to each other, but also before the entire town. Yet each time a wedding date approached, Bazelle found a reason to postpone it. Work as a stonemason on distant jobs, a lack of money, his mother's illness. The excuses changed, but the outcome remained the same. Susan waited patiently for years. She sewed her trousseau, gathered household items for their future home, and planned the life they were supposed to share. Whispers began to circulate around town. Some residents sympathized with her. Others muttered that she had endured the situation for far too long. Bazelle's parents were openly opposed to the marriage, believing Susan to be an unsuitable match and not financially well off enough for their son. Then, without warning or explanation, Bazelle married another woman, a girl half his age who, according to local rumor, was already pregnant by him. For Susan, it was a devastating blow, and a public humiliation played out before the entire community. Shattered and determined to defend her reputation, she filed a lawsuit against Bazelle for breach of promise to marry and insisted on a public trial, even though such cases were usually settled quietly and discreetly. That hearing was scheduled for the very next day, the day after Susan Hansen was killed. Law enforcement launched an investigation immediately, and suspicion quickly fell on Joseph Bazelle. He had an obvious motive. The court hearing scheduled for the following day threatened to publicly disgrace him and potentially result in a substantial financial judgment. Susan Hansen was widely respected and well-liked in the community, and investigators found no evidence that she had any other enemies. detectives conducted a thorough examination of the crime scene. In the soft earth beneath the Hanson kitchen window, they discovered clear footprints. The size and tread pattern matched the work boots Bazelle was known to wear. Nearby were deep ruts left by a wagon's wheels, along with distinctive horseshoe impressions. When police compared these marks with Bazelle's wagon and horse, the similarities were striking. The wheel spacing and the shape of the horseshoes appeared to be an exact match to those found at the scene. Bazelle was arrested and charged with murder. However, he had a serious alibi. A stonemason by trade, Bazelle had been working on the construction of a bridge in Wolfboro. His usual route home did not pass anywhere near the Hanson residence. It followed an entirely different road. Moreover, several independent witnesses testified that they had seen Bazelle at his home around 7 o'clock that evening, precisely the time the fatal shot was fired. Given the distance between Wolfboro and Brookfield, as well as the distance between Bazelle's home and the Hanson house, it would have been physically impossible for him to commit the murder and return unnoticed. The defense attorneys went further, offering an alternative suspect. They pointed to Charles E. West. In 1861, a fire had destroyed the farm buildings of John Churchill, killing 20 head of cattle and other livestock. West had been convicted of arson and served a prison sentence for the crime. The defense argued that Susan Hansen had been a key witness against him, giving West a possible motive for revenge. That theory quickly collapsed. A review of court records showed that although Susan had been summoned as a witness in the arson case, she had not actually given any testimony. West, who had since been released from prison, firmly denied harboring any resentment towards Susan and provided his own alibi for the night of the murder. On May 4, 1875, the trial of Joseph Bazelle for the murder of Susan Hansen began in Ossipee, New Hampshire. The case drew intense public attention. The courtroom was packed, and residents from surrounding towns traveled in to attend the proceedings. The trial was extensive in scope. More than 100 witnesses were called to testify for both the prosecution and the defense. Prosecutors laid out their case by emphasizing Bazelle's alleged motive, the physical evidence found near the Hanson home, and his behavior before and after the crime. The defense countered methodically, challenging each claim and presenting testimony that placed Bazelle elsewhere at the time of the shooting. In an unusual move, the jurors were even transported by train to Brookfield so they could personally view the crime scene and judge the layout of the area and the distances involved. Ultimately, the circumstantial evidence against Bazelle proved too weak. The footprints could have belonged to anyone. His alibi was supported by multiple witnesses, and no direct evidence linked him to the crime. After 2.5 hours of tense deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom and delivered its verdict: not guilty. Joseph Bazelle walked free. Bazelle's freedom did not last long. Just 2 years later, the case took an unexpected and dramatic turn. In 1877, 2 private detectives from Boston, Samuel Cohen and John Conway, were investigating the long-dormant 1861 arson of John Churchill's farm. At first glance, the crime appeared unrelated to the murder of Susan Hansen, but the detectives were re-examining old leads and questioning individuals connected to the earlier case. During their inquiry, they came across Charles Cook, a 22-year-old laborer who worked for Joseph Bazelle. Cook was described as a simple young man of limited intellect, though he was not considered mentally ill or incapable of understanding his actions. After prolonged questioning, Cook made a stunning admission. He confessed to killing Susan Hansen. According to Cook, the murder had been carefully planned by Bazelle. Bazelle allegedly offered him $500, an enormous sum for a hired laborer at the time, to carry out the killing. On the evening of November 2nd, Cook took a loaded shotgun and met Bazelle on the road. Together, they traveled to the Hanson home. Once there, Bazelle led Cook to the kitchen window, where Susan was sitting with her family. Seeing her clearly through the lighted window, Bazelle ordered Cook to fire. Cook hesitated and refused. At that point, Bazelle threatened to kill him if he did not comply. Terrified, Cook aimed the weapon and fired the fatal shot. Afterward, Bazelle quickly hid the gun in a hay mower, and the two men fled in separate directions. The most astonishing detail of Cook's confession was this. During Bazelle's first trial in 1875, Charles Cook had testified as a defense witness. Under oath, he stated that he had seen his employer at home around 7 o'clock that evening, the exact moment Susan Hansen was killed. Authorities immediately reopened the investigation and arrested both Charles Cook and Joseph Bazelle. It appeared, at last, that justice might be served and that those responsible for Susan Hansen's death would face punishment. Instead, prosecutors found themselves entangled in a serious legal dilemma. Bazelle had already been tried and acquitted of Susan Hansen's murder. Under the principle of double jeopardy, enshrined in the law, a person cannot be tried twice for the same crime following an acquittal. This protection of defendants' rights was fundamental and impossible to circumvent. Recharging Bazelle with murder was legally barred. After extensive deliberation, prosecutors devised a solution that was both inventive and controversial. Rather than charging Charles Cook as the actual killer, they granted him immunity and made him the prosecution's key witness. Bazelle, meanwhile, was charged not with murder itself, but with aiding, abetting, and procuring the crime. A grand jury formally indicted Bazelle for counseling, hiring, and inciting Charles Cook to commit the murder of Susan Hansen. On paper, this constituted a different offense from murder, even though it arose from the same act. Bazelle's attorneys reacted with outrage. They argued that this maneuver was a clear violation of the prohibition against double jeopardy, that their client was once again being tried for the same crime, merely under a different legal label. In December 1877, the defense appealed to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, demanding that the case be dismissed. In March 1878, the court issued its decision. The justices ruled that Bazelle's acquittal as the principal perpetrator did not preclude his prosecution as an accomplice and organizer of the crime. Legally, the charges were distinct. The case would proceed. In July 1878, Bazelle was tried once again in Ossipee, and the proceedings drew intense public attention. The prosecution's central witness was Charles Cook, whose testimony proved crucial to the outcome of the case. This time, the jury deliberated for 4 hours, carefully weighing the evidence and witness statements before returning a unanimous verdict. Bazelle was guilty. On July 10, 1879, the judge formally pronounced the final sentence: death by hanging. Bazelle was immediately transferred to the New Hampshire State Prison in Concord, where he was to await execution. Once again, Bazelle's defense team moved swiftly to appeal. His attorneys raised serious procedural objections, challenging the trial judge's instructions to the jury and forcefully renewing the fundamental constitutional argument that their client was being subjected to double jeopardy, punished twice for the same crime. While the New Hampshire Supreme Court was reviewing Bazelle's appeal, the public narrative surrounding the case shifted dramatically. In late 1878, detectives Samuel Cohen and John Conway were arrested by Boston police under deeply incriminating circumstances. Known within law enforcement circles as the Twin Evils, The pair had spent years running a criminal racket under the guise of legitimate investigations. Their method was disturbingly systematic. They formally investigated crimes, but in reality sold their conclusions to the highest bidder. In some instances, they allegedly committed arson or robberies themselves, only to later solve the crimes for a generous fee from the victims, framing convenient scapegoats through fabricated evidence and intimidated witnesses. This time, they were caught in the act while attempting to tamper with a railway switch at a busy Boston Providence station. According to investigators, the plan was to cause a train derailment and then profit by investigating the resulting disaster. While being held in pretrial detention, a bitter dispute erupted between the two men over the division of money. Conway, realizing he was being set up to take the fall, chose to save himself and gave a detailed statement against Cohen. It was during this confession that Conway brought up the Bazelle case. According to him, Charles Cook's confession had been entirely fabricated. In the summer of 1877, Cohen and Conway had arrested Cook on a pretext related to old arson cases and held him for an entire week in the basement of a private house, denying him access to lawyers or family. The young laborer was systematically terrorized, shown newspaper clippings about executed arsonists, threatened with 20 years of hard labor, and then offered an escape. Endorsed the correct version of Susan Hansen's murder in exchange for freedom and even money. Conway claimed that Bazelle was innocent and that the entire operation had been financed by someone in Brookfield who wanted the case closed at any cost. He refused to name the person who paid them, seemingly hoping to use that information as leverage in negotiations with prosecutors. After the detective's arrest, authorities tracked down Charles Cook. By then, he was no longer working for Bazelle and was scraping by on odd jobs in a neighboring town. When he was brought in for questioning, Cook appeared pale and frightened, clearly aware that he was trapped between charges of perjury and accusations of complicity in murder. This time, his testimony took an entirely different turn. Under oath, Cook stated that he had never participated in the killing of Susan Hansen and had not even known her personally. He claimed that the entire story of the nighttime ride to the Hansen home, Bazelle's threats, and the fatal shot through the window had been invented by Detective Cohen. After his arrest in the summer of 1877, Cook said he was held for a week in a dark basement where the detectives interrogated him for hours at a time, deprived him of sleep, and terrorized him with threats of prison and the gallows. Exhausted and disoriented, he eventually agreed to repeat the version of events that had been drilled into him until he memorized it word for word. In a written statement, Cook confessed, "I can no longer bear to see an innocent man waiting to die because of my words. I would rather go to prison myself for perjury than know that my lies have killed a man." He went on to describe how the detectives rehearsed every detail of his testimony with him, forcing him to memorize the layout of the Hansen house from a diagram and drilling him on answers to anticipated courtroom questions. Bazelle's defense attorneys immediately added Cook's new statement to their appeal, but the prosecution reacted with open hostility. The prosecutor publicly declared that they now had two contradictory statements from the same man and that they considered the first, given in court in 1878, to be the truthful one. Cook was arrested on charges of perjury. Prosecutors advanced an alternative narrative, claiming that the recantation had been written by James Edgerly, a local farmer and outspoken supporter of Bazelle, who had been gathering signatures for a petition of clemency. According to this version, Edgerly had visited Cook, convinced him that Bazelle faced an unjust execution, and persuaded him to sign a prepared statement. Cook, they argued, was too simple-minded to fully grasp the legal consequences of the document. On June 8, 1879, nearly 5 years after the murder, the New Hampshire Supreme Court issued its final ruling in the Bazelle case. A panel of 3 justices unanimously denied the defense's request for a new trial. In a 30-page opinion, the court addressed every procedural objection raised by Bazelle's attorneys, from the wording of the indictment to the instructions given to the jury, and found no grounds for reversal. In an editorial, the Boston Daily Advertiser observed, "The court's decision is written in language intelligible only to trained lawyers. To the ordinary reader, it is a collection of procedural technicalities in which the central question, whether the man is actually guilty, disappears from view." The newspaper cautiously suggested doubts about the fairness of the verdict, while stopping short of making direct accusations against the judicial system. Bazelle's attorneys made one final effort, submitting a petition for clemency to Governor Nat Head. The petition included dozens of letters from Brookfield residents, Cook's sworn recantation, and press accounts detailing the corruption of the detectives. The governor, weighing political considerations and public opinion, denied the request without explanation. The state's position was clear. The trial had been conducted, the verdict lawfully rendered, and the justice system must remain consistent. The execution was scheduled for July 10, 1879. Bazelle spent his final weeks in solitary confinement at the New Hampshire State Prison in Concord. He was permitted only limited visitors, the prison chaplain, the warden, and representatives of the prosecution. Each of them, separately and together, pressed him for the same thing, a confession. For the authorities, a public admission of guilt before execution would have closed the case once and for all, silenced lingering doubts, and affirmed the righteousness of the verdict. Bazelle refused. In a conversation with 2 journalists who had been granted special permission to see him, he spoke bitterly. "They give me no peace, day or night. The chaplain comes and speaks of saving my soul through repentance. The warden hints that a confession would ease my final hours. The prosecutor promises that my family will be spared disgrace if I tell the truth. But what truth? I did not kill Susan Hansen. I have nothing to confess." On the morning of July 10th, he was led into the prison's inner yard, where the gallows had been erected. By law, the execution was witnessed only by officials, representatives of the state, a physician, a clergyman, and 12 designated witnesses. The sky was gray, and a light rain fell steadily. As the executioner adjusted the noose, the chaplain asked one final time, "Do you have anything to say?" Bazelle answered loudly so that all could hear, "I am innocent of the death of Susan Hansen. God knows the truth." At 11:06 a.m., the trapdoor dropped with a heavy crash. Death was instantaneous, caused by a fracture of the cervical vertebrae. His body remained suspended for the required 20 minutes, after which the physician pronounced him dead. Joseph Bazelle was buried in the prison cemetery without funeral rites, as was customary for those executed for murder.